Hello, welcome again to another lecture in our course on Prajnaparamita. This one will deal with not only the idea of how the text of the Prajnaparamita expanded, but we'll try to determine, if we can, some of the significance of the expansions. In other words, the fact that they added material is one issue. The type of material that was added is another. And finally, the significance of the material. We know some of this has been, of course, in the preceding lectures, so forgive me for just reiterating a few items that I would like for you to think about. We know that the main expansion of the Prajnaparamita family of texts was from 8,000 all the way up to 100,000 lines. So we have 8,000, 10,000, 18,000, 25, and finally 100,000. Those are not exact numbers. In every case, the actual numbers of verses that we deal with come close to those, but not always exactly on the 1,000 mark. But nevertheless, here we have a family of texts that gets expanded manyfold from 8 to 100. And yet they maintain the same basic teaching. So how do you do that? How can you expand endlessly on a text, adding so much, and not totally change the direction? The 100,000 line version of the Prajnaparamita is very understudied, and with good reason. It's so long. Recently, the announcement is made that in Germany, they are going to translate the 100,000 line version from Tibetan into English. So I think that we're going to see in the future how much and how important these expansions have been to the 100,000 line version. In many cases, the expansion has been such that instead of just a statement about an entry, the 100,000 line will give you the entire list. So they just don't say the heavens above. They list all 100, 200 heavens above. So in one sense, I think that people are going to find, when they really begin to use the 100,000, that you've got a record of exactly what's meant by all of the major lists in the Mahayana. And it's going to be worth translating, and it's going to be worth the study. So I hope that all of you who are in this course will remember that when the translation finally appears. It's going to take a while, I'm sure. So what was the nature of the expansion from the 8 to the 100,000 line version? Some have called it an accordion. expansion. That is, the content remained very similar. It was just expanded, but not really changed in terms of what you find. And I would say that up to the 100,000 line version, there's a great deal of the differences between the different sets of texts that is truly a kind of accordion in this definition. So you can look at now the 18,000 line version has been translated from Tibetan by the 84,000 translation project. And you can compare that 18,000 line with the 8,000 line that I have given you from Kumarajiva's Chinese version. And they're very similar in a lot of ways. And yet you will see that the expansion is significant. And part of that expansion is already the expanding the list of things, but also adding material which is not present in the previous one. In many cases, when you look at the expansion, you can see some of them which I would describe as commentary. That is, what's added is an explanation for a statement. So while we find a statement in the 8,000 line version, in the 18, we find some areas where attached to particular divisions is an explanatory expression of some length. It almost seems to me that in the redactions, when they were making the print version, people may have added interlinear notes, which then later people took to be a part of the text itself. And instead of being interlinear, where people had just jotted in between the lines for their own record, their jottings became part of the text itself. So explanation was one type of this expansion. However, in this lecture, I'm going to take another type of expansion, and one which is very difficult at first to understand what possible significance it can have. You've already had the lecture on the audience. We know that in the tradition of the texts that talk about the audience for the teaching of Shakyamuni, that the first group that he taught were 5 ascetics that he had known before his enlightenment. And once he was enlightened, he wandered until he found them again. And the story of how he had to convince them that even though he was no longer practicing deep asceticism, the message that he had was worth listening to. You will see in this first image here that you have 6. And the question is, what is this 6th character that's in the image? Some people feel that it's Ananda, an arhat, and that Ananda was the one who heard everything Buddha taught and therefore recited it back when people tried to remember what he had taught, so that this image might be used to tell us that they believed that Ananda was already with the Buddha at the time when he gave his very first sermon. If he wasn't there, who remembered it? Of course, in the Prajnaparamita, the audience is not just the 5 early people. It says that there are 1,250 people who are all arhats in the audience when the Buddha teaches the Prajnaparamita. So that it's a decided growth in the audience. But as we go through the following pages of the Prajnaparamita Sutra, the audience grows exponentially. And that's something we will be exploring. The texts tell us, for example, when this inconceivable and equal to the unequal teaching was taught, 500 bhikshus and 30 bhikshunis, nuns, through not seizing anything, stopped the sensory flood and attained mental release. 60,000 upasakas, lay men, 30,000 upasikas, lay women, with respect to the things, attain purity of the vision of the Dharma. And 20 bodhisattvas became receptive toward the non-arising of things. And in this virtuous eon, they will all become Buddhas. It's an interesting audience. The monks, bhikshus, outnumber the nuns, bhikshunis, 500 to 30. So it says that the audience is dominantly male. The same is true for lay people. 60,000 laymen, and half that number, 30,000 lay women, attain the vision of the Dharma. And then there's this interesting addition of 20 bodhisattvas. So out of all of the audience that was being covered with this, it's really interesting to see that we're down to 20 bodhisattvas and thousands of laymen and bhikshunis and bhikshus. But as we go through the sutra, the audience grows even more. 100,000 gods of the Yama heaven, that's just one of the heavens, 100,000 gods, as well as 100,000 gods of Tushita heaven, and 100,000 gods of the heaven of those who delight in magical creations, and another 100,000 gods of the heaven of those who have mastery of the creations of others. This huge audience of hundreds of thousands of gods make offerings. So we now see this incredible growth of the audience for the Prajnaparamita. And this is one of the ways in which the text itself was being expanded. These units were added, which describe all of these deities. So we need to understand what was happening and why was it so important that the audience be increased and that the gods and the heavens became part of the environment which was hearing and listening to the Prajnaparamita. Now, in terms of ancient Indian cosmology, and the Buddhists do use this as well. It's a very primitive kind of cosmology, but of some interest, because this is an idea that this earth that we dwell on is part of a mountain that has risen from the sea. And this mountain has the moon and the sun circling it. So sometimes it's daytime and sometimes it's night. Sometimes the moon is visible, sometimes not. Above this are as many as 17 heavens. And beyond the heavens are 4 places which are beyond any form or recognizable way of seeing them. Beneath this island, which floats on an ocean, are the realms of ordinary people, but also the hells. So we have gods above it, we have hell beings below it. Now, this was a form of cosmology which was found in the Vedic tradition, as well as being adopted to some degree by the Buddhists. But I don't think that this is the dominant form of cosmology which we find in the Prajnaparamita. In the Prajnaparamita, we find these heavens, yes, and the heavens are inhabited by hundreds of thousands of deities. And these hundreds of thousands, if we've just pointed out, of deities come to hear the Prajnaparamita. They shout and jump with joy. They are so delighted and so excited to see what they call the second turning of the wheel of Dharma, which means the second great teaching. The first being when the Buddha first made his first sermon. And now the Prajnaparamita is considered to be a second turning of the wheel. I think that's a very significant moment in the Buddhist history, that they began to have the idea that the teaching had 2 periods of start. When you look at all these heavens and all these thousands and hundreds of thousands of deities which are before us, it seems to me that what we are witnessing is that the Prajnaparamita moves from being an earthly teaching to a cosmic one, and that we are in the midst of trying to deal with cosmology here. So let me talk about cosmology for just a moment. We in the West are right now in the midst of, and have been for some time, changing ideas about cosmology. In astronomy, we have the observation of the visible sky with its stars and planets. And this observation was done for as long as people have looked up at the starry sky to this vision of the starry sky, however, in Europe, the development of, as well as, of course, in China itself, the development of telescopes, that is the ability to magnify the light that strikes the earth from the stars, permitted us to have a more precise view of this. We could begin to see craters on the moon. We could see the circles around Saturn. That was, of course, these observations with telescope brought about an enormous debate in Europe, in which the church was very much involved. And the issue was that, having made these observations, Galileo in particular said, well, we're wrong. We say the earth is the center of everything, and everything revolves around our earth. But when we use these instruments and we use the mathematical formulas that we can now calculate of all of it, that's not what happens. The reality is the sun is the center of it, and we, as the earth, along with the other planets, are revolving around this sun. Well, it went against the teachings at that time of the church. And so it was something which Galileo had to finally, even though he believed it firmly, he had to say, okay, it's not so. So the idea about even our own solar system has a lot to do with our beliefs and who we are and what the reality of the world is. And just as they debated this one little issue about astronomy, is an indication to us that as you change your view of the universe or the cosmos, you're changing your ideas to such a degree that you have to think seriously about what's happening with the way in which I believe. So just like the expanded audience of the Prajnaparamita, I think we could say makes it into a cosmology. So we have faced in the last 2 centuries a new idea about how our world, our universe, our stars, our planets, our galaxies, how they came into existence. And it has changed our whole idea about, number one, how old our Earth is, how long has it been in existence? Is it eternal? Is it unchanging? Cosmology has arisen to deal with and to try to explain. I don't know, I'm calling the expansion of the audience of the Prajnaparamita as a cosmology. I wish we had another word. It was both observation, but it wasn't just the origin or the development of the universe that the expanded audience implied. It was the impact of that idea which the Buddhists had to deal with. We're still trying to understand when Einstein first made one of his great observations, he made a terrible mistake in 1917, or before 1917, in which he held or believed strongly that the universe was static, that everything that we see had been created and it was here in a particular form, and we could study it. But then lots of things began to happen to question that and to question it seriously. In particular, what began to happen to change our cosmology was the idea that we are in motion. And we're not only in motion, but our universe as we see it, our galaxies and everything that we see are in motion of outward expansion. And this came about when, in 1965 in particular, when the cosmic microwave background could be finally seen and understood. This microwaves were left over from the early expansion. And so our cosmology has forced us to understand that we're not standing still, that our universe is not static, that it is changing, and we are roaring at great speed outward, and that this outward motion is in fact increasing in speed, and that eventually this outward expansion will never stop, and that as it moves further and further, expanding more and more, eventually everything will be pulled into just a flow of photons. So we're having to change our whole idea about who we are and what our Earth is. And this cosmological study is something which happened when cosmology was taken from theology, in which it was based on the idea that God was the creator and the sustainer and maintenance of a static or a manageable universe, to physics and mathematics, which could understand this incredibly expanding and enlargement of a universe. And not only that, but even in this century, new ideas have come, such as that perhaps we're not just one universe, but multiverses, billions of universes, trillions of universes. And this is something which is challenging us because, number one, we probably can never really prove it. It's too big. Maybe we will do it mathematically as a probability, but we probably can never figure out how to enter into a world of multiverses that are so far beyond even our universe. For example, will we ever be able to have information from the farthest reaches of our own universe that started with the Big Bang? We have sent out rockets, and we're letting them just go and go. And maybe in 30,000 years, they will reach the limit of our galaxy. We won't be around, they won't be functional. So we are not so smart as we think we are, in one sense, in terms of what's out there and what's happening. The greatest discovery, I suppose, is when Hubble pointed out that certain stars, certain galaxies were showing a red shift. And that's when he could begin to tell us, if they have a red shift, that means they are moving away from us. If they had a blue, it means they're moving toward us. But if they're moving away from us, it means that the universe is expanding and it's not static. So in the West, we're just as much into this cosmological issue as the Prajnaparamita texts ever were. And we have something called distant viewing, which is very controversial, but it's a part of our military exercises, as it was for the Russians, to try to train people. And sometimes it seemed to be successful, to be able to have a distant view of something far beyond what their normal range of eyesight or experience would be, to determine what was happening in the enemy's backyard. And there are people today who will describe having been in that program with the military for many years. They will describe their abilities, which they feel they developed, in which they could have distant viewing. So distant viewing is an issue because we look at the starry sky and we cannot, just by looking with our eyes at the starry sky, come up with a cosmic view of a universe. And what did the Buddhists and the Prajnaparamita have when they began to talk about hundreds of thousands of deities in multiverses after multiverses out there in the heavens? Was it a form of distant viewing that they were able to tap into? Well, the only thing that we have from them, which gives us some hint, are the list of trance states called samadhis that had names. And one of the ways in which the Prajnaparamita expanded was that the names of these samadhis kept getting more and more and more. And even in the early Prajnaparamita, it says, we're just giving you part of the list. There are actually 64,000 of these states. And what happens in these trance-like states of meditation, samadhi? You hear the gods speaking. You see the Buddhas in far distant places. You have distance viewing is what it amounts to. Someone asked Kumarajiva, the famous translator, when he was in China, with that heavenly eye, that is, with this distant viewing, which you can see the universes, you can see the Buddhas in the 10 realms, 10 directions. Is it true? Or is it just a metaphor? They asked Kumarajiva. And his answer was, no, you really see the Buddhas. So when we read in the Buddhist, in the Prajnaparamita, that there were devas and spirits and humans, and they were in the heavens, and they were beneath the earth, and they were on top of the earth. And when they heard this Prajnaparamita, they all jumped for joy. So the cosmology that developed for the Prajnaparamita was one which, number one, said, this is not just taught for people in the Ganges Valley by Shakyamuni. This is something which is being taught because it expands far beyond our visual realm. It goes into the heavens and beyond. And I think this was important for one thing that was important was to say that the idea of the Prajnaparamita, that is the doctrine of emptiness, was not just the emptiness that was seen in our immediate perceptions, in our immediate environment, in the things that we feel, taste, touch, but something which was the reality of this emptiness is cosmic. It's not just local to our subjective experience. In other words, part of the audience expansion with all the gods was to say that the teaching goes beyond subjective experience. It goes far beyond it, in the sense that everything which is being taught is something which has to be true, not only locally, but beyond all of our subjective experience. And I think that was a big issue for the Buddhists, because people did have a belief in things which were beyond subjective experience. And the question was, these experiences I have, which are beyond my eye, ear, nose, taste, tongue, in the normal sense of perception. What are those experiences? Are there such experiences? Are they real? Does the teaching hold true for those realms as well as this one? So that I think when we began to look at what happened with the expansion of the Prajnaparamita text in terms of an audience which was cosmic instead of local, that was an enormous step in terms of talking about the reality of the way things are. That there is a cosmic realm which is beyond our subjective experience. And yet in that, if you can, through meditation or through special things, as we do with our science, with instruments, if we penetrate to that beyond subjective experience, what's true in that realm? And they were saying, Prajnaparamita, the teaching of the Prajnaparamita is true with all those gods. They're all needing it. They all need to know about this teaching, as well as people in the Ganges Valley. And that was one of the reasons why the expansion of the audience was so important. Suzuki Roshi in San Francisco made a very interesting statement. He said it must be obvious that there is a contradiction in wanting to be perfectly secure in a universe whose very nature is momentariness and fluidity. In other words, how can you say, I want to be absolutely grounded and secure? I know I'm standing on this earth, but wanting to be secure, wanting things to be steady, solid, unchanging is one thing. But suppose we began to have the experience that the very nature of everything is momentariness, is change, is fluidity. Then you can't have that same perfect security of something not moving, something not changing. So this has led a lot of discussion to say, is gravity a type of consciousness? Is there consciousness in the universe, which are the rules which govern it, the ways in which it moves, the fact that it's expanding, is that a form of consciousness? And of course, from the point of view of the Christian cosmology, is this proof of God, that God is controlling it, that there is some agent which is making it happen the way it happens? So when we look at this expanded audience, the Prajnaparamita, it's not just that suddenly there are 100,000 gods instead of 5 individual people or 6. It's that the perception of what we are experiencing is being challenged and shook up. And so once again, it comes down to perception. Is what we perceive in our mind an internal? But what about the external? If the external extends not only through our whole universe, but beyond this universe to multiverses, are we living in and are we not a part of that? We're part of this universe. We're swirling and moving with it. Our very being, our very physical form is all part of what's happened with this universe. The way in which atoms have been dealt with. We're all in it. But is it not the case that if there is something beyond this universe, aren't we part of that too? Aren't we part of a multiverse if there is one? Can we ever perceive it? Is there some way in which our perceptions, if we were able to deal with them in a different light, would give us a vision of what multiverses are going to be, would be like, or are like, even though from another perspective, there is no way that we can be able to transform or to rise above the limitations of space, and endless time. So what I've done is I'm saying to you, you look at the expansion of the Prajnaparamita text, you can describe it in terms of a few, counting the numbers of sentences of the expansion. And that's of interest too. You can look at the sentences that are added. You can analyze those sentences and you can put them into patterns. And you can say the things which the expansion has covered are these. So if we do that and we find out that one of the ways in which the expansion took place was to really transform the message of the Buddhist from an earthly founder in the Ganges basin to a cosmic realm where the message is being heard, the message is being followed, the message is an accurate description of multiverses, worlds and realms far beyond anything which our sensory organs can perceive. And even though it's far beyond what we can perceive, perhaps from another perspective, we are part of it. We're not separated from all this cosmological idea. So we look at just one type of expansion of Prajnaparamita. And I think it was crucial and really important because it showed the Buddhist a way of thinking about the whole idea of human existence as being part of a cosmological whole. And that the message which was being taught and the doctrines which were being taught applied not only to what we can perceive on this earth, but whatever we can imagine, project, comprehend of what is out there in this multiverse that we are part of. So I hope when you read the Prajnaparamita, you'll understand why perhaps one of the expansions was to take it from the Ganges Valley and transform through the description of the audience into a cosmological teaching. Thank you very much.